What happens when a neighborhood rule enforcer thinks she's above the law and ends up cutting the lock off a police task force jeep? This is the story of how one HOA leader's obsession spiraled into scandal, flashing lights, and charges she never saw coming. Picture this. You've just poured your savings, your sweat, and your patience into buying a house you thought would give you peace. A place to finally breathe after years of working late nights and chasing criminals through alleys and back roads. That's exactly what Tobias Greenfield, a 44-year-old detective, felt when he pulled into the quiet community of Cypress Hill Commons in San Antonio, Texas. He wasn't looking for trouble. He wasn't looking for drama. He just wanted somewhere calm where he could park his Jeep, sit on his porch, and let the world go on without him for once. But peace is fragile, and in this neighborhood it was guarded, or maybe strangled, by one woman's iron grip on the rules. Her name was Marjorie Kline. To the casual eye, she was a retiree with too much free time, walking around with a clipboard like she ran City Hall. But to the people living on Cypress Hill Drive, she was the self-appointed enforcer of the Homeowners Association. Where others saw neighbors, she saw violations. Where others saw harmless quirks, she saw threats to property values. She made it her mission to control everything, from the length of your grass to the shade of curtains in your windows. The first time Tobias met her, he was hauling boxes from his Jeep into his house. She strolled over in khaki pants and a visor, holding her clipboard like it was a badge. "You know," she said, eyeing his driveway, "we try to keep a certain standard here. Most people park their cars inside the garage." Tobias, sweating through his shirt and balancing a box of kitchenware, gave her a polite smile. "I'll keep that in mind," he said. He didn't want a fight, not on move-in day. But Marjorie didn't move. She pointed at the Jeep, her tone sharp. "And that thing, what's with the big lock on the wheel? Makes it look like some kind of problem vehicle." Tobias set the box down and looked at her squarely. "It's called security," he replied. "Helps keep my car from getting stolen." Marjorie pursed her lips, writing something on her clipboard. "Well, around here things don't get stolen," she said. "This is a safe community." Tobias didn't argue. He just lifted the box again, walked past her, and went inside. But the tone had been set. She wasn't finished, not by a long shot. In the days that followed, Tobias noticed her eyes on him. When he took his morning jog, she was out pruning roses, watching. When he returned from a late shift, her blinds twitched. When he parked the Jeep, she would sometimes walk past, shaking her head like it offended her. Neighbors had warned him. "That's just Marjorie. She likes to keep tabs on everyone." But what they didn't say out loud was that she seemed to have a special interest in Tobias, an interest that wasn't just about us. One evening, while Tobias was grilling in his backyard, his next-door neighbor Victor Hensley leaned over the fence. "You've already caught her attention," Victor said, chuckling nervously. "Careful with that Jeep. She once called a tow truck on a guy for having a work van in his driveway." Tobias raised an eyebrow. "For real? That's ridiculous." "Yeah, well," Victor shrugged. "She thinks she's saving the neighborhood." Tobias shook his head, flipping a burger. "She's gonna learn she's messing with the wrong person." But here's the twist. Tobias wasn't the type to go looking for fights. He had spent years keeping his cool, working undercover in dangerous situations and diffusing conflicts before they exploded. He knew patience could be a weapon. Yet sometimes, patience is mistaken for weakness. And Marjorie Kline was about to cross a line that couldn't be ignored. Because to her, that Jeep wasn't just a car. It was a target. She saw the lock as a stain on her perfect community, something she had to erase. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly imagine, was that the Jeep was more than steel and rubber. It was a piece of law enforcement equipment tied to investigations that reached far beyond the walls of Cypress Hill Commons. Marjorie believed she was protecting her community. Tobias knew she was about to put herself in the crosshairs of something far bigger. And as their paths collided, neighbors would soon realize that a small act of arrogance could spiral into headlines, handcuffs, and lessons nobody would forget. But this wasn't just a clash of personalities. It was the beginning of a storm that would shake the entire neighborhood. The tension between Tobias Greenfield and Marjorie Kline didn't simmer for long. It boiled. What started as side glances and scribbles on a clipboard soon turned into the first real confrontation. And it happened in the middle of the day, in plain view of neighbors who pretended to mind their business while secretly watching from porches and windows. It was a Tuesday afternoon in June. The sun baked the pavement on Cypress Hill Drive, and Tobias had just finished a late shift. He pulled into his driveway, the Jeep's tires crunching against the gravel edge. As always, the bright yellow steering wheel lock glared from inside the windshield like a warning sign. Tobias shut off the engine, slung his duffel bag over his shoulder, and started toward his front door. That's when he heard her. "Mr. Greenfield!" Her voice cut across the street like a whistle. Tobias turned, already bracing himself. Marjorie Kline marched across the road, visor tilted low, clipboard in one hand, a rolled-up HOA newsletter in the other. "Yes?" Tobias asked evenly. Marjorie stopped at the edge of his driveway, her arms crossed. "We've spoken before about parking. Your garage is empty, yet you continue leaving this Jeep outside. That violates Section 4B of our community guidelines." Tobias exhaled slowly. "I told you, I work late. It's easier to park here than pull into the garage every single night. And my garage isn't exactly empty. I've got boxes stacked in there while I finish moving in." Marjorie's eyes flicked toward the Jeep. "And that lock? It's an eyesore. Makes the whole street look like we're living in a high crime zone." Tobias set his duffel bag down on the porch and turned to face her fully. His voice was calm, but there was a steel edge beneath it. "With all due respect, Ms. Kline, it's my vehicle. I'll secure it how I see fit." The exchange drew the attention of Gloria Ramirez, who lived 2 houses down. She watered her plants while listening, though her head didn't move an inch. From behind curtains across the street, a child's face appeared, wide-eyed, before quickly ducking away. Marjorie wasn't fazed. She straightened her clipboard as if it gave her authority. "This community maintains certain standards. You knew that when you bought your home. If you can't follow the rules, perhaps you'd be happier somewhere else." Tobias let out a short laugh, dry, humorless. "I've spent 20 years in law enforcement. I'm not moving just because you don't like the way my car looks in my driveway." That was when Victor Hensley, the neighbor who had warned Tobias, stepped onto his porch. "Marjorie, maybe give the guy a break, huh? He just moved in. No harm done." Marjorie shot him a glare sharp enough to cut glass. "Victor, this doesn't concern you." Victor held up his hands. "Everything concerns us when you're marching up and down the street like a sheriff. He's not hurting anyone." The standoff grew heavier. Marjorie scribbled furiously on her clipboard, muttering about fines and violations. Tobias shook his head and picked up his duffel. He wasn't going to fuel the fire any further. Not that day. But Marjorie wasn't done. The very next morning, Tobias found a printed letter taped to his front door. In bold letters it read, "Notice of violation. Vehicle improperly stored in driveway. Steering wheel lock not in accordance with community standards. Immediate action required." Beneath it was a threat of a $100 fine. Tobias crumpled the paper in his fist. Later that day, he walked straight to Marjorie's house. She answered the door with a smug smile, clearly expecting him. "Morning," Tobias said, holding up the wrinkled notice. "You left this on my door." "That's right," Marjorie replied, "and there will be more if you don't comply. I have the full backing of the HOA board." Tobias stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Let me make something clear. That Jeep isn't just a car. It's tied to my work. You mess with it. You're messing with more than me." Marjorie's smile flickered, just for a second. But pride is stubborn, and hers was thicker than steel. "Rules are rules," she said flatly, before shutting the door in his face. Back on the street, Tobias clenched his jaw. He had seen criminals bluff, liars weave stories, and thugs try to puff their chests. But Marjorie Kline was in a category of her own, a woman convinced she was untouchable because she hid behind bylaws and fine print. What Tobias didn't realize, though, was that Marjorie was already plotting her next move. She wasn't satisfied with warnings. She wanted action. She wanted the Jeep gone. And soon she would take matters into her own hands. But her obsession wasn't just about rules. It was about control. And control, when taken too far, always snaps. The letter on Tobias Greenfield's door was just the beginning. For Marjorie Kline, it wasn't enough to file a violation or hand out a fine. She wanted to make an example of him. In her mind, Tobias represented everything wrong with new residents. Too independent, too defiant, too unwilling to bow to her idea of order. And once Marjorie set her sights on you, there was no shaking her off. The following week, Tobias noticed a change. Neighbors who had once waved politely now avoided his eyes. Some crossed the street rather than walk past his driveway. Rumors spread in whispers, claims that he was reckless, that his Jeep was abandoned, that maybe he wasn't even who he said he was. Tobias could sense Marjorie's fingerprints on every story. She wasn't just fighting him in person, she was poisoning the air around him. One evening, while Tobias was unloading groceries, Victor Hensley strolled over, his expression tense. "Look, Tobias," he said quietly. "I need to tell you something. Marjorie's been going around the board, trying to get votes to escalate your case." Tobias frowned, setting a bag down on the hood of the Jeep. "Escalate how?" Victor rubbed the back of his neck. "She wants the HOA to classify your Jeep as a blight to community standards. If she gets enough support, she can push for forced removal. She's quoting bylaws I didn't even know existed." Tobias sighed. "You've got to be kidding me." "I wish I was," Victor replied. "She's telling folks your Jeep makes the neighborhood look unsafe. Some people believe her. They don't want trouble, so they just nod along." Tobias leaned against his Jeep, arms crossed. "Unsafe? It's a vehicle, not a threat." Victor gave him a sympathetic look. "You know how it works. If she repeats it enough, people start thinking it's true." Tobias clenched his jaw. He'd dealt with gang leaders, drug dealers, and career criminals who knew how to manipulate fear. Marjorie wasn't any different, just armed with a rule book instead of a weapon. Days later, the HOA meeting confirmed Victor's warning. Tobias attended, sitting near the back of the small community hall. Marjorie stood at the front, papers stacked neatly on the podium. Her voice was steady, confident, rehearsed. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, "our community prides itself on maintaining a standard. We've worked hard to create a safe, clean environment for our families, but recently we've faced challenges. A certain resident has chosen to disregard these standards. His vehicle, parked visibly with a steering wheel lock, creates an impression none of us want associated with Cypress Hill Commons." Several heads turned toward Tobias. He stayed quiet, watching. Marjorie continued, "We can't allow one person's disregard to lower the value of our homes. That's why I propose we enforce stricter action. If voluntary compliance isn't possible, then removal is our only option." At that, Tobias stood. "With all due respect," he said, his voice calm but carrying through the room, "you're misrepresenting the situation. My Jeep isn't abandoned. It's in use, and the lock is there because of the work I do. I've lived here less than 2 months, and already you're trying to push me out." Marjorie gave him a thin smile. "Mr. Greenfield, this isn't personal. It's about rules. If you can't follow them, perhaps this community isn't the right fit for you." Tobias met her gaze, unblinking. "Or maybe the problem isn't the rules. Maybe the problem is how you're twisting them." A murmur rippled through the room. For a moment, Marjorie's composure cracked, but she quickly recovered, banging the gavel against the podium. "We'll vote on the motion next week. Until then, the fines will continue." After the meeting, Tobias walked out into the warm Texas night. Victor caught up with him. "She's not letting this go, man. She's got it in her head she's saving the neighborhood." Tobias shook his head. "Saving it from what? A car with a lock on it?" Victor shrugged. "Doesn't matter. She's got influence. People fall in line because they don't want to be her next target." Tobias glanced back at the hall, where Marjorie was laughing with other board members. "She's pushing too hard," he said quietly. "People like her always do. And when they cross the line, there's no turning back." What Tobias didn't realize was that Marjorie was already preparing to cross that line. She had the bolt cutters ready, the tow company on speed dial, and a plan to prove, at least in her own mind, that she was in control. But control built on fear is fragile, and Marjorie was about to find out just how quickly it can break. Saturday morning. The heat was already rising over Cypress Hill Commons, the kind of Texas heat that sticks to your skin. Most residents were indoors, sipping coffee or mowing lawns early before the day became unbearable. Tobias Greenfield was at the precinct, finishing paperwork from a long week of undercover work. That's when Marjorie Kline made her move. She had been rehearsing this moment all week. In her garage, a pair of heavy-duty bolt cutters leaned against the wall, purchased from a hardware store 3 towns over, so nobody local would ask questions. Marjorie told herself she wasn't doing anything wrong. She was simply protecting the community. That phrase had become her shield, justifying everything. She slipped on gloves, tucked her visor tight, and marched across the street. The Jeep sat quiet in Tobias's driveway, its grey paint glinting in the sunlight, the steering wheel lock glaring through the windshield like a stubborn challenge. Marjorie muttered under her breath, "Eyesore. Complete eyesore." She raised the bolt cutters, clamped them over the bright yellow lock, and pressed with all her weight. Snap! The sound echoed louder than she expected. A clean break. The lock fell to the floor mat with a dull thud. "Finally," she whispered, satisfied. She pulled the driver's door handle. It opened. She slid into the seat, ignoring the faint smell of leather and faint traces of something official she couldn't place. Extra wiring near the dashboard, a small mounted radio tucked under the console. It didn't matter to her. All she cared about was victory. Within minutes, a tow truck rolled up, its diesel engine rumbling. Marjorie had called ahead, insisting it was an abandoned vehicle. The driver, a middle-aged man with a sunburned neck named Rick Daly, hopped out. "This the car?" Rick asked, eyeing the Jeep. "Yes," Marjorie replied firmly. "It doesn't belong here. Against HOA regulations." Rick scratched his head. "Looks in good shape. Belongs to someone." Marjorie snapped. "It's a violation. Do your job." Rick hesitated. But money was money. He pulled the chains, hooked the Jeep, and winched it onto the flatbed. As the Jeep tilted upward, a few neighbors emerged from their porches. Gloria Ramirez gasped, covering her mouth. Victor Hensley muttered, "Oh no." "She didn't." Gloria called out, "Marjorie, what are you doing? That's Tobias's car." Marjorie didn't flinch. "It's not about him, Gloria. It's about rules. If we let one person get away with this, soon everyone will think they can do whatever they want." Victor shook his head, stepping closer. "You're going too far. You can't just cut someone's lock and tow their car." Marjorie turned on him, her voice sharp. "If you're not willing to stand up for this community, then stay out of my way." The Jeep was now fully loaded onto the truck. Rick secured the chains, still uneasy. "Where do you want it dropped?" he asked. Marjorie waved dismissively. "Take it to the impound lot. I'll handle the paperwork." As the truck pulled away, Tobias's Jeep disappeared around the corner, the chains rattling in the distance. Marjorie dusted off her hands as though she'd just performed a service project. "That's how you keep order," she muttered proudly, turning back toward her house. But not everyone shared her pride. Gloria whispered to Victor, "She's out of control. Tobias is going to lose it when he finds out." Victor shook his head, his voice low. "No, it's worse than that. He's not the type you can push around. And that Jeep? I don't think she has any idea what she just messed with." Hours later, when Tobias returned home, the empty driveway stopped him cold. He stood still for a moment, staring at the vacant patch of concrete. His Jeep was gone. The steering lock he always used, gone too. His gut tightened. He knew instantly this wasn't a mistake. Someone had touched his vehicle. Dropping his duffel bag, Tobias stormed across the street to Marjorie's house. He pounded on the door. It swung open, and there she was, standing smug with arms folded. "Looking for something?" she asked. Tobias's voice was low, steady, dangerous. "Where's my Jeep?" "I had it towed," Marjorie said without hesitation. "You've been warned enough times. Maybe now you'll listen." Tobias leaned in, his eyes locked on hers. "You had no right. That Jeep isn't just my car. It's part of my work. Do you understand what you've done?" Marjorie scoffed. "Work, community, whatever excuse you want to make. Around here, the rules come first." For a long second, Tobias just stared at her. He wanted to unleash the full weight of his fury, but years on the job had taught him restraint. He straightened, his voice cold. "You crossed the line." He turned and walked away, but Marjorie couldn't resist one final jab. "No, Mr. Greenfield, you did." Victor, watching from his porch, whispered under his breath, "She just lit a fire she can't put out." But Marjorie's pride blinded her. She believed she'd won. In reality, she had just triggered a chain reaction that would bring police cars, flashing lights, and consequences far bigger than HOA fines. When Tobias Greenfield's Jeep was towed away, the shock hit him like a punch to the chest. He'd lost vehicles before, seized in stings, burned out in ambushes, even riddled with bullets on assignments. But this wasn't the street. This wasn't the job. This was his own driveway, his own home. And someone who thought she was above everyone else had crossed a line she didn't even understand. The first thing Tobias did was head straight to the impound lot. He drove his secondary car, a plain black sedan, through the hot afternoon traffic until he reached the lot on the edge of San Antonio. He walked up to the small office where a young clerk sat behind bulletproof glass, chewing gum and scrolling on her phone. "I'm here for a Jeep, grey, 4-door, towed from Cypress Hill Commons this morning," Tobias said, sliding his ID through the slot. The clerk glanced at the ID, then tapped at her computer. "Yeah, we got it. Says here it was marked as abandoned." Tobias clenched his jaw. "Abandoned? That vehicle is registered, insured, and fully operational. It was parked in my driveway." The clerk raised her brows, unimpressed. "You'll need to pay the tow and impound fee before release. That's $275. Tobias leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Listen carefully. That Jeep isn't just my personal car. It's tied to an ongoing task force operation. You have no idea what's inside it. Now, either you release it immediately, or I'll have half the San Antonio Police Department down here asking why evidence has been tampered with." Her gum froze mid-chew. She glanced nervously toward the garage, then back at him. "Hold on, sir. Let me get my manager." Minutes later, Rick Daly, the same tow driver who hauled the Jeep, appeared with grease-stained hands. "Look, I was just doing my job," Rick muttered. "She said it was abandoned. She signed the release form as an HOA officer." Tobias fixed him with a stare sharp enough to cut steel. "Do you have any idea what you touched? That vehicle has surveillance equipment, files, sensitive material. If any of it is damaged or missing, you'll be answering to federal investigators." Rick swallowed hard. I didn't look inside. Just hooked it up and dropped it off. Good," Tobias said flatly. "Because if anything's missing, that woman and your company won't just be paying fines. You'll be facing obstruction charges." Within half an hour, the Jeep was released. Tobias checked it top to bottom before driving it out. Nothing had been stolen, but the lock was gone, and that alone made his blood boil. The steering lock wasn't just a piece of metal. It was a line of defense, a signal to thieves and a safeguard for what the Jeep carried. When he pulled back into Cypress Hill Commons, word had already spread. Neighbors peeked from their porches. Some looked sympathetic. Others looked nervous, guilty even, like they didn't want to be caught choosing sides. Victor stepped forward as Tobias parked, shaking his head. "You got it back?" Victor asked. "Yeah," Tobias replied, slamming the door. "But this isn't over." Victor lowered his voice. "She's bragging, Tobias. She told a few people she cleaned up the street. Like she did everyone a favor." Tobias's eyes darkened. She doesn't realize what she's done. As if on cue, Marjorie emerged from her house, clipboard in hand, visor casting shade over her face. "I see you retrieved your vehicle," she called out, smugness dripping from her words. Tobias walked across the street until he was just a few feet away. Neighbors lingered nearby, pretending not to listen, but hanging on every word. "You trespassed on my property. You destroyed my lock. You tampered with my vehicle. That's criminal, Marjorie. Not just HOA business. Criminal." Marjorie folded her arms. "Don't threaten me, Mr. Greenfield. I acted in the best interest of this community." Tobias leaned closer. His voice was low, but everyone heard it. "That Jeep is tied to an active police task force. You interfered with law enforcement. Do you have any idea how serious that is?" For the first time, Marjorie's expression faltered, but she recovered quickly, laughing dismissively. You expect me to believe that? Nice story. Sounds like an excuse for breaking the rules. Victor cut in, unable to hold back. Marjorie, you've gone too far. He's telling the truth. I've seen him leave at all hours, working cases. He's not lying. Marjorie's eyes flickered nervously, but pride forced her chin high. If that's true, then let the police handle it. I won't be intimidated. Tobias shook his head slowly. Oh, they'll handle it. Count on that. The crowd murmured. People shifted uncomfortably, realizing this wasn't a neighborhood spat anymore. This was something bigger, something that could drag them all into the spotlight. That night, squad cars rolled down Cypress Hill Drive. Their flashing lights washed the pristine lawns in red and blue. Officers stepped out, knocking on doors, asking questions. Neighbors whispered from behind curtains, realizing Marjorie's crusade had invited the very thing she claimed she was protecting them from: chaos. But the real storm was only beginning, and Marjorie was about to learn that breaking one man's lock had unlocked a world of consequences she couldn't control. By the time the sun rose the next morning, Cypress Hill Commons didn't feel like the same neighborhood. The sight of police cruisers crawling through its manicured streets left a mark on everyone who lived there. Conversations were clipped, glances were suspicious, and nobody wanted to be the first one caught talking. Tobias Greenfield hadn't planned on making his work public, but Marjorie Kline had forced his hand. Before noon, 2 unmarked cars and a black SUV rolled into the subdivision. Out stepped men and women Tobias knew well, colleagues from the South Texas Regional Task Force, a joint effort between local law enforcement and federal agents. These weren't patrol cops here to take a statement. These were investigators. And they were angry. Tobias stood with them in his driveway, arms crossed, as neighbors peeked from their blinds. One officer, Detective Carla Mendoza, looked at him with frustration and sympathy. Tell me it's not true, she said. It is, Tobias replied, his voice steady. She cut the lock, called a tow truck, had the Jeep hauled off like it was trash. Carla pinched the bridge of her nose. We've got evidence in there. Notes, surveillance feeds, gear. If that truck driver had gone poking around, we could have had an entire operation compromised. Nothing's missing, Tobias assured her. But the fact she touched it at all. He trailed off, staring across the street. Marjorie's blinds were drawn, but he knew she was watching. Another officer, Agent Paul Granger, stepped forward. His tone was clipped. We can't ignore this. Tampering with government property, that's obstruction at minimum. Arrest her. One of the younger agents muttered, but Carla shook her head. We need to do it by the book. File reports. Loop in the DA. If we overstep, it'll look like retaliation. Tobias exhaled, his patience thin. She thinks this is just about HOA rules. She has no clue what she's stepped into. At that moment, the blinds across the street snapped shut. Seconds later, Marjorie Kline herself emerged from her front door, clipboard clutched tightly as if it were a shield. Her chin was high, but her steps betrayed nerves. Mr. Greenfield, she called, striding toward the group. I see you've brought company. The officers turned, their expressions stony. Carla stepped forward. Are you Marjorie Kline? Yes, she said, voice firm. Vice President of the Cypress Hill Commons HOA. Carla held up her badge. Detective Mendoza, South Texas Regional Task Force. We need to ask you a few questions about a Jeep you had towed yesterday. Marjorie's jaw tightened, but she didn't back down. That vehicle violated community standards. It was improperly stored and presented an image of criminal activity. I acted within my authority, Paul Granger scoffed. Authority? You broke into a law enforcement vehicle. That's not authority. That's a crime. Gasps rippled through the small crowd that had gathered on the sidewalk. Gloria Ramirez covered her mouth, whispering, Law enforcement vehicle? Victor gave Tobias a knowing look, as if to say, I told you this would blow up. Marjorie faltered for the first time, her face paling. That's not possible. He never said... Tobias cut her off, his voice low and sharp. I warned you. I told you not to touch my Jeep. But you wouldn't listen. You had to prove you were in control. Marjorie's lips quivered. but pride forced her to stand taller. If that's true, then shame on you for not informing the HOA. We have a right to know what's happening in our community. Carla's voice hardened. You don't have a right to interfere with an active investigation. Do you realize the risk you created? What if sensitive information had leaked? What if suspects caught wind because you couldn't mind your boundaries? The crowd grew restless, whispers flying. A few neighbors shook their heads in disgust. One man muttered, "She's dragged us all into this." Marjorie's eyes darted between the officers and the faces of her neighbors. For once, she wasn't commanding the room. She was trapped in it. Tobias stepped closer, his words deliberate. You didn't just cross a line, Marjorie. You bulldozed it. And now, you're not just dealing with me. You're dealing with the law. Carla nodded. We'll be filing a report. Expect to be contacted by the district attorney's office. Until then, don't go near that vehicle again. Understand? Marjorie opened her mouth to argue, but the weight of silence pressed down. The officer's stares, the neighbor's judgment, the truth of what she'd done. It all sank in. She gave a stiff nod and retreated to her porch, her shoulders rigid, but her face drained of color. As the officers packed up and left, Tobias stood in the middle of his driveway, watching the neighborhood watch him. Victor walked over quietly. Guess the whole block knows now, Victor said. Good, Tobias replied. They needed to. But while the truth was out, the fallout was only starting. And the more people learned, the more the neighborhood would fracture under the weight of Marjorie's pride. By Monday morning, Cypress Hill Commons was buzzing with speculation. Nobody wanted to admit it out loud, but everyone knew Marjorie Kline had poked the wrong bear. The flashing lights from the task force vehicles had burned an image into their memories. And now, the HOA vice president, the woman who once dictated the color of front doors and the number of lawn ornaments allowed, was the subject of a police inquiry. Detective Carla Mendoza returned that morning with 2 other investigators. They weren't in uniform this time, but their presence was unmistakable. Clipboards, plain suits, the kind of posture that told you they were here for answers. They started by knocking on doors. At Gloria Ramirez's house, Carla sat at the dining table, pen poised. Mrs. Ramirez, did you witness Ms. Kline approach Mr. Greenfield's vehicle? Gloria nodded quickly. Yes, she had those big cutters. She just walked up like she owned it, snapped the lock, called the tow truck right there in front of us. And did she mention why? Carla asked. Gloria hesitated. She said the Jeep looked suspicious, like it didn't belong here, but everyone knew it was his. We all saw him drive it every day. Carla scribbled notes. Thank you. That lines up with what others have said. Meanwhile, across the street, Victor Hensley was giving his own account. I told her she was going too far. She wouldn't listen. Marjorie thinks the HOA gives her police powers. She's been pushing people around for years. This time, she picked the wrong fight. Victor's wife chimed in from the kitchen, her voice carrying. She called Tobias a troublemaker before he even unpacked his boxes, said he'd lower the neighborhood's standards. I think she wanted him gone from the start. The detectives exchanged looks. It wasn't just about a lock anymore. It was starting to look like a campaign. Back at Tobias's house, he sat across from Agent Paul Granger, filling out official paperwork. His face was calm, but his hand pressed hard against the pen as he wrote. You want my honest opinion? Paul asked. Always, Tobias replied. She should be charged. Clear case of criminal mischief and interference with law enforcement. If it were anyone else, they'd already be in cuffs. Tobias leaned back in his chair. You and I both know politics get messy. The DA will weigh her age, her record, her role in the HOA. They'll try to spin it as a misunderstanding. Paul snorted. A misunderstanding? Cutting a steering lock and towing a task force vehicle isn't a misunderstanding. It's reckless. Agreed, Tobias said. But I've been on the other side. I've watched cases fall apart because people called it overreach. If she gets a slap on the wrist but the neighborhood finally sees her for who she is, maybe that's the real punishment. Just then, the doorbell rang. Tobias opened it to find Marjorie herself standing there. Her visor was gone, her hair pulled back tight, but she still carried that clipboard like it was armor. We need to talk, she said stiffly. Tobias stepped aside, letting her in under the watchful eye of Paul, who didn't bother to hide his skepticism. Marjorie stood in the living room, eyes darting between the men. "I realize now that perhaps I acted hastily. But you must understand, Mr. Greenfield, I was only thinking of the community." Tobias's tone was measured, but his stare was unyielding. "Thinking of the community? Or thinking of control?" Her cheeks flushed. "You've been confrontational since the moment you moved in. You don't follow rules, you act like they don't apply to you." Paul cut in sharply. "Rules don't give you the right to tamper with federal property. You're lucky this conversation is happening here, and not in an interrogation room downtown." Marjorie stiffened, but Tobias leaned forward, lowering his voice. "You don't have to like me. You don't even have to respect me. But if you ever touch my property again, or interfere with my work, there won't be another warning. You'll be in handcuffs." For the first time, Marjorie didn't snap back. She looked at Tobias, then at Paul, and realized she was cornered. Without another word, she turned and left, slamming the door behind her. Paul exhaled. "She's rattled, but people like her don't stay quiet for long," and he was right. That evening, the HOA board convened an emergency meeting in the clubhouse. Marjorie sat at the head of the table, her voice shrill with indignation. "They're trying to intimidate me," she declared. "They want to paint me as some kind of criminal when all I did was enforce our rules. If we let this slide, we're giving away our authority." But this time, the board didn't rally behind her. One member, Howard Pike, raised his hand. "Marjorie, you crossed a line. You didn't just enforce a rule, you broke the law, and now we're all caught in the fallout." Others murmured in agreement. Even those who once feared her began shifting in their seats, realizing the woman they followed had become a liability. Marjorie slammed her fist on the table. "I did what none of you had the courage to do. I protected our community." Silence followed. No applause, no support, just the sound of her own words echoing back. But pride is stubborn, and Marjorie wasn't ready to admit defeat. And the more her neighbors pulled away, the more desperate she would become to prove she was right. By midweek, Cypress Hill Commons had gone from a quiet subdivision to the latest headline in San Antonio's evening news cycle. A neighbor had leaked video footage from a doorbell camera, the one across from Tobias's driveway, that captured the entire moment Marjorie Kline snapped the steering lock and waved down the tow truck. The clip made its way to Facebook, then onto local stations. By Tuesday night, it was running with a chyron at the bottom of the screen. HOA leader accused of tampering with police vehicle. Suddenly, the story wasn't just a neighborhood squabble. It was public scandal. Reporters camped near the subdivision entrance, sticking microphones out to anyone willing to comment. Most residents ducked their heads and drove past, but a few couldn't resist. Gloria Ramirez told one reporter, "I warned her. We all did. She didn't listen. Now she's dragged us all into this mess." Victor Hensley was more blunt. "She overstepped. She thought she was untouchable. Turns out she isn't." Inside her home, Marjorie sat in front of her television, horrified. She had always thrived on control, but now the narrative was out of her hands. Every channel replayed the moment the bolt cutters clamped down. Every replay made her look less like a leader and more like a criminal. That night, her phone rang endlessly. Some calls came from HOA allies, telling her to keep her head high. Others came from angry residents, demanding she step down. One voicemail was especially sharp. "Marjorie, this is Howard. You've embarrassed this board. You've embarrassed all of us. We're holding a vote next week. Don't expect us to back you up." Meanwhile, Tobias kept his head down. He wasn't one to seek the spotlight, but it followed him anyway. A reporter caught him outside his driveway, microphone thrust forward. "Detective Greenfield, do you have a comment about your HOA vice president interfering with your vehicle?" Tobias shook his head. "No comment. The investigation will speak for itself." But as he turned to leave, the reporter pressed, "Do you think she targeted you specifically?" He paused, looking straight into the camera. "Yes," he said simply, before walking inside. Those 3 letters, yes, set off another wave of speculation. Social media lit up with debates. Some argued Marjorie's actions were rooted in personal bias. Others defended her, saying she was just trying to enforce rules. But the overwhelming consensus was clear. She had crossed the line. By Thursday, the HOA meeting room was packed like never before. Residents who hadn't attended in years showed up, eager to see the fallout. Marjorie walked in with her clipboard clutched against her chest, her chin raised in defiance. But the room's energy was different now. No nods of support, no whispered greetings, just cold stares. Howard Pike opened the meeting. "We have to address the obvious. Our vice president's actions have brought unwanted attention to this community. The police are involved. The media is involved. This isn't sustainable." Marjorie stood, her voice trembling with frustration. "I was protecting Cypress Hill Commons. That Jeep was a violation. I acted decisively when no one else would." From the back, Gloria called out. "You didn't protect us. You endangered us. Now we're the laughingstock of the city." Murmurs of agreement filled the room. A resident named Alan Brewer raised his hand. "I've lived here 15 years, never had cameras in our neighborhood until now, never had reporters chasing me down at the grocery store. You did this, Marjorie, not Tobias, you." Her face reddened. "You're all turning against me because of one mistake." Victor's voice cut through. "It wasn't a mistake, it was arrogance, and you still won't admit it." The tension thickened until Howard tapped his gavel. "We'll hold a vote next week regarding Ms. Kline's position on this board. Until then, she is suspended from all decision-making authority." Gasps filled the room. For the first time in years, Marjorie had been stripped of her power. She slammed her clipboard on the table and stormed out, muttering about betrayal. Outside, a small crowd of neighbors followed, their whispers harsh. A few muttered about lawsuits. One woman snapped, "She should be arrested, not suspended." And just when the pressure couldn't get heavier, another blow landed. That evening, the local news anchor announced, "Sources confirm that the Bazar County District Attorney's Office is reviewing charges against HOA Vice President Marjorie Kline after allegations of tampering with a police task force vehicle." The neighborhood watched from their living rooms, jaws tight, realizing this wasn't just a community issue anymore. This was the law circling in. But Marjorie wasn't ready to surrender, and the more cornered she felt, the more unpredictable she was about to become. The announcement from the district attorney's office hit Cypress Hill Commons like a thunderclap. For years, Marjorie Kline had been the voice that carried weight in every meeting, the hand that circled violations in red ink, the presence people either feared or tolerated. Now that same voice was under review by prosecutors, and the neighborhood could feel the shift. On Friday morning, Marjorie woke to find a news van idling near the subdivision entrance. She peeked out her window and saw a cameraman adjusting his tripod. Panic flickered across her face. For the first time in years, she didn't march out on her morning patrol. She stayed inside, blinds drawn, phone pressed to her ear as she called every board member one by one. "Howard, you can't let them do this to me," she pleaded. "We have to stand united. This community will crumble if I step down." Howard's reply was curt. "Marjorie, the community is already crumbling. Because of you." He hung up without waiting for her protest. By mid-afternoon, a letter from the HOA circulated to every household. It was short, but heavy. Effective immediately, Marjorie Kline is suspended from the board pending investigation. The letter didn't need more words. Neighbors understood. She was finished. Meanwhile, Tobias sat at his kitchen table, sipping coffee while scrolling through his phone. Messages poured in from colleagues across the state. Some congratulated him for keeping his cool. Others asked how he hadn't snapped. Tobias chuckled at one text from an old partner. "Bet she wishes she'd messed with the wrong guy instead." Yet beneath his composure, Tobias felt a gnawing frustration. He hadn't moved into this neighborhood to become the center of a scandal. He wanted peace, and peace had been ripped away before he'd even settled in. That evening, Gloria and Victor stopped by his porch. Gloria handed him a pie wrapped in foil, an old-fashioned gesture of solidarity. "You didn't deserve any of this," she said softly. "She made you the enemy when all you did was park your car." Tobias smiled faintly. "Appreciate it. But I'm not the one paying the price anymore. She is." Victor leaned against the railing. "And she's still not admitting she was wrong. She's telling people this is some conspiracy to take her down." Tobias shook his head. "People like Marjorie never see themselves as the problem. It's always everyone else." While Tobias found a small pocket of support, Marjorie faced isolation. Friends she once counted as allies avoided her calls. Neighbors crossed the street to escape her glare. Even her closest confidant on the board, Elaine Porter, told her quietly at the clubhouse, "I can't defend you anymore. You went too far." That night, Marjorie attended what should have been a routine HOA gathering. But instead of dictating the meeting, she sat silently at the back while Howard took charge. The agenda was clear: address the crisis, reassure residents, and distance the HOA from Marjorie's actions. Howard spoke plainly. "We cannot excuse what happened. The board's role is to maintain order, not to overstep into criminal behavior. We will cooperate fully with investigators." Every eye turned to Marjorie. For once, she didn't speak. Her clipboard lay untouched at her feet. Outside, the crowd of residents swelled larger than usual. Anger and exhaustion mixed in their voices. One man shouted, "She should be arrested." A woman added, "She embarrassed us all." The pressure was undeniable. Back in her home later, Marjorie stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror. Her shoulders sagged, her face pale. For years, she believed her grip on the HOA made her indispensable. But now, stripped of power and facing charges, she realized the truth. She had become the cautionary tale, and the legal side was closing in fast. Detective Carla Mendoza confirmed with Tobias the next morning that the DA's office was weighing 2 charges: criminal mischief and obstruction. If filed, Marjorie could face fines and possibly probation. Tobias nodded. "That's fair. She deserves to be held accountable, same as anyone else." Carla studied him. "You know she'll never admit fault. Some people just can't." Tobias leaned back in his chair. "Maybe she doesn't have to. Maybe the consequences are bigger than her admitting anything. She's lost her power. She's lost her reputation. That's punishment in itself." As the days passed, neighbors began reclaiming their sense of community. Children rode bikes again. Couples walked their dogs without glancing over their shoulders for Marjorie's clipboard. The neighborhood felt lighter, freer. But Marjorie? She remained behind closed doors, blinds drawn, living in the shadow of her own downfall. And while the legal system prepared its judgment, the real verdict had already been delivered, by the very people she once ruled over. When the dust finally settled over Cypress Hill Commons, the story of Marjorie Kline and Tobias Greenfield was more than just neighborhood gossip. It was a parable playing out in real time, about pride, power, and the consequences of letting both go unchecked. Weeks after the incident, the district attorney's office formally announced that Marjorie would not face jail time, but would be cited for criminal mischief and obstruction, both misdemeanors. She was fined, ordered to pay restitution for damages, and required to complete community service hours. For someone who had strutted through the neighborhood like a lawmaker, the punishment was humiliating. She had gone from handing out violations to wearing a fluorescent vest, picking up trash along the highway under the watchful eye of county supervisors. Neighbors whispered when they drove past her on their commutes. Some felt pity. Others felt vindicated. Most just felt relief. The tyrant of Cypress Hill Commons had finally been disarmed. For Tobias, life began to return to something resembling normal. His Jeep remained parked proudly in his driveway, steering wheel once again locked in place. Nobody complained now. Nobody dared. When he walked his dog in the evening, people waved again, this time with genuine warmth instead of nervous glances. One Saturday, Victor and Gloria joined Tobias on his porch. They sipped iced tea, enjoying the quiet. Gloria spoke first. "It's different now, lighter. Almost like everyone realized they don't have to be afraid anymore." Tobias nodded. That's what happens when people stop letting fear dictate their choices. For too long, everyone let one person's voice control them. All it took was one mistake to show how fragile that control really was. Victor chuckled. "You'd think she'd apologize. But I doubt that day will ever come." Tobias leaned back, his gaze steady. "Some people never say sorry. And maybe that's fine. The point isn't waiting for their apology. It's learning from what they did. Pride can make someone believe they're above consequences. But pride doesn't erase accountability." The three sat in silence for a moment, the weight of his words sinking in. Across the street, Marjorie's house sat dark, her blinds closed as usual. She rarely came out anymore. The neighborhood had moved on, but she was stuck in the wreckage of her own choices. The lesson wasn't lost on anyone. Parents used it as a teaching point for their kids. Don't let arrogance cost you friendships. Couples reminded each other not to let small conflicts spiral. And for Tobias, it was a reminder that authority, whether in a badge, a title, or a clipboard, means nothing if it isn't grounded in respect. Weeks later, a new HOA election was held. Howard Pike was chosen as president, and the board promised a new direction, one that focused on cooperation instead of punishment. As Tobias listened to the speeches, he realized the neighborhood had found its balance again. They weren't perfect, but they were free from the shadow of one person's obsession with control. On his porch that evening, Tobias thought about all the cases he'd worked as a detective. Drug busts, gang wars, sting operations. None of them had prepared him for the bizarre reality of battling an HOA leader with bolt cutters. Yet in its own way, this experience was just as revealing as any case file. It showed him how small acts of arrogance could snowball into disasters, and how resilience, not retaliation, was often the most powerful weapon. Looking into the camera of the reporter who later asked for closing remarks, Tobias kept it simple. What happened here isn't just about me or one neighbor. It's about remembering that power doesn't give you the right to trample over others. Respect does. If you don't have that, you've already lost. And that was the takeaway. Not just for Cypress Hill Commons, but for anyone watching. Rules exist for order, yes, but when they become weapons, they destroy the very community they're supposed to protect. Respect, patience, and humility. Those were the real laws that kept people together. The story of Tobias and Marjorie ended not with handcuffs, but with lessons etched into the memory of everyone who lived on that street. And for those of us hearing it now, the question is simple. How often do we let pride guide our choices, and what would it cost us if we let it go too far? So if this story left you with something to think about, hit that subscribe button, because stories like this remind us power fades, but lessons stay.